Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today we're doing part 2 of the Queen Macherie character review. Just completed part 1 earlier, which was the base and total stat overview, a little bit about the report card and grading all of her general attributes, which is now why we're going into part 2, which is the class and job analysis, looking a little closer at the abilities themselves, which ones are relatively strong, and give her the most upside and distinguish her from other spellcasters, but more importantly, the AI and auto skill prioritization. That is a critically underrated part of a character regardless of what you see on paper, and until you understand how they function in game, well, it really doesn't matter what the abilities themselves are. Finally, we're going to look at the TMR review and how it stands up in the state of the game, and then my general thoughts encapsulating everything we've seen so far about her as a character, which leads us to part 3, where I have a lot of fun stuff to talk about, where we learn how to min-max her, how best to equip her, and situationally where she shines. So getting into the passive abilities here, I gave this a C+ in the report card because Tribute of the Silver Wolf, the top one here, is absolutely stellar. Increased accuracy of 25, spear penetration of 40, and a 50% chance to reduce the enemy counter ability. That's huge in one passive. The rest of them, though, they really are more for build-specific things, not necessarily like changing how she operates or functions or giving her any big stat changes. Two of them, in my opinion, are almost kind of useless. The height 3 to height 2 is obviously unique to the Arithmetician Sub only, so you'd only use this if you're using that sub. And she is not a healer. We're going to get to that in auto and AI prioritization soon. But level 4 to level 3, the other Arithmetician one is also kind of useless because at level 120, they're both divisible by both numbers, so it doesn't really matter. The null CT changes is kind of useful, but she actually doesn't prioritize any of her time mage abilities on herself, so you really don't need that in most instances, which leads to speed cast, which is a critically important one. We're going to talk about this a little more in part 3. But overall counter abilities, nothing too special, but they're good enough to make her do what she needs to do, so I'm okay with it. Now the counter abilities, I also went B- here, because B- wise, there's nothing really unique about these. Royal Reprehension is a preemptive ability, which is awesome, 30% chance. It's typeless magic attack, got some good range on it. Damage distribution is nice to absorb some health back, just for survivability reasons. And slow counter is obviously on its own a good one, 50% chance to proc and to inflict slow on the enemy. So all three of these have their usages, their pros and cons. I think Royal Reprehension is probably a safe one to use at all times, but there's definitely situations where I think the other two certainly are very good as well. Now we get into the main job. We're going to look at the buffs here first, and then we're going to look at the offensive abilities. So she's got two main buffs. Queen's Edict is kind of similar to Joker's in that it grants Protect for 3 turns to allies in a cross-shaped AoE. It also grants her Magic Attack 50 for 3 turns. That's a pretty big modifier increase. It's got an AoE height of 1, so she can go next to a teammate that's 1 level below or above her and still use this. The other one here is Spirit of Horn, which does have a little cast time on it, but it's essentially her re-raise ability that when she does re-raise, she actually gets 2 small little buffs. And the first one is a restoration of 200 CT. If you're thinking about the bar, that's 20 out of 100, so it's helpful, but not enormous. But the second one here is the decreased attack skill activation time of 550 for 4 turns. So obviously the intent here is that if she dies, she can re-raise, hopefully get her turn quicker, and if she uses an ability, she won't get attacked again before it goes off. So it's kind of like a last-minute Hail Mary. So while these abilities are nice, if you're having to rely on these to have her spell cast faster, that you're not in a good place. But both really valuable buffs. Now when we get into the active abilities of the main job, one thing that's kind of interesting to note, her basic attack is a magic type attack, 70% modifier. That's a little bit different than many spellcasters who are actually strike type damage, which means when they do a physical attack, it barely does any damage because they have no attack stat. That's not the case here, though. That being said, you probably won't be running out of AP very often, just noteworthy. Now for the main abilities, she's got some decent versatility here between some unit-specific and AoE-specific ones. Now when it comes to the ranges and heights, her 2 single-target ones, these first two, Disparage and Evocative Vestige, are height 1. For the Glimmer of Conviction and Drain Strike, they're actually height 2 in terms of how you can hit someone, and that AoE will actually hit enemies within 1 height of each other, so she's got some height flexibility here. When we look at the abilities a little closer, you'll note that 3 out of the 4 are reflectable, which means they're runic shieldable from Celeste. Drain Strike is the exception where it's not. 2 of them have cast time, 2 of them don't, so some flexibility there in terms of the timing. And 3 of them are magic type, and Drain Strike is strike type. All of these things really interesting in how she can potentially attack her opponents. Now, Disparage is a 25% spirit reduction. We haven't seen any spirit breaks in quite some time, so this is nice that most people aren't necessarily gearing their trust stones for it as often anymore. Evocative Vestige is a really interesting one. This is a one-time spear penetration of 50, so in conjunction with the passive, it's 90 spear penetration on 1 attack. It has an increased 30% hit chance, so really jacks up her accuracy, and increases the summon gauge by 125. I'll talk about that at the very end, just a smidge. Now, Glimmer of Conviction is a genuinely awesome ability. 220% is a really great modifier here. It's a very, very wide forgiving AoE, and it breaks magic barriers for targets. So anyone that's trying to mitigate her damage via magic barrier, not going to help you here. And the upside here is when you talk about types of barriers, ones that are general or all attack types, magic and physical, just because they're hybrid or general barriers doesn't mean that this won't apply. This will still break it for them because they do technically prevent magic damage. So really awesome from that perspective. And Drain Strike is an awesome ability as well, just because of the unique attack type, the modifier 220, and the absorption of 30% damage done, which she is a 97 faith unit. She'll curatively take back a decent amount of health. Overall, pretty solid for main job abilities. Now, when we look at the sub job of the Queen, these two abilities a little more niche for PvE content. Law of Fortitude is a really good one here. It's got a height 2. It's a curative ability of 210% potency. Will also increase their elemental resistance by 20%. This one isn't not necessarily reliable in auto PvP though. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but it is a very strong curative ability. And Halting Force, because there's no damage associated with it, the odds of her actually using it in the majority of instances are rather low. Really good sub job, just not for auto. When we look at the next one though, Arithmetician, now the big caveat here, most characters, and we'll see this in the AI section, use the Arithmetician for some potential curative ability on like follow-up guild attacks or follow-up guild defense. She does not. This girl does not want to heal at the very least. So the Arithmetician here genuinely is for some extra range, some extra height differences. It's essentially a way to augment her main job in terms of flexibility and range of how she potentially attacks. I really don't have much more to add to that than that. Now we get into the Time Mage side of things. This is a quicken less Time Mage job. She does not have that, which is genuinely unfortunate. And just speaking generally in the modern state of the game for Time Mage, Haste is really the only good one here. The rest of these obviously are actually great for PvE content should you need these status effects, but not going to be useful for you in auto PvP. And even then, the reliability of Haste going off is actually kind of difficult. We'll talk about that in just a minute here. Which finally brings us to the Limit Break, which is this fantastic AoE. Little limited in its range. I probably would have liked to see 1 square extra, but range height 1, AoE height 1, 200% modifier. It's a 38% Earth Imperil. This is obviously going to do great things for the damage output of her and her teammates, so big thumbs up on this Limit Break. The really cool thing about this Imperil, when you combine it with Oberyn, who is a very meta Earth character, is that his Limit Break is decrease all elemental resistance, which does stack with Earth resistance, a different kind of Imperil technically. So if the two of them get their Limit Break off, like, good night. I can't see many things living through that. Now, when we talk about the Mastery ability, this is where she gets her 10 AoE resistance in addition to the HP and Earth attack that everyone else does, but she also gets 20% counter reduction on her abilities, which, when you combine that with the Queen's passive, reaches 70% counter reduction, and if you add the Truststone passive of 20% as well, that's a 90% reduction in the odds to proc their counter ability. This is actually super useful. A lot of people think of the pesky counter abilities like Reflex, but there's less of that nowadays, and there actually are some counter abilities, which this is super helpful against. When you think about ones like Sodali, who is a buff remover, dispels all buffs, other enemies that have preemptive damage, ones like she does, she'll obviously ignore taking that extra damage. But honestly, the low-key most underrated one is actually the tank passives. A lot of tanks have counter abilities that reduce significant portions of incoming damage. And so when you're talking about being able to cleave through tanks, particularly with that 90 spirit penetration ability she has, she can prevent their counter ability from reducing the damage. That's obviously going to go a long way for her maintaining some consistent damage as well. Now we look at the AI and auto prioritization. This is extremely important. It was actually kind of eye-opening in my opinion. So number one, she has a DPS AI. It means she will always attack an enemy in range rather than buff or do anything else. Always. Now we get through the rest of her abilities. Queen's Edict, which is her protect ability that she moves to a teammate, is always number one, and she will not use it multiple times in a row. A lot of times with teammate AoE, she'll use it on one and then she'll circle back around to another. That is not the case with this. She will only use it once until it wears off, and then she'll prioritize it again. The other thing here is that it will supersede any kind of heals you'll ever get on the Arithmetician or her main sub job. That's a little unique. It's kind of like Renan in that he always prioritizes his personal barrier before he uses any devout healing. That's not always the case with characters. That is the case here, though. Now, after she uses Queen's Edict, she will prioritize her TMR next, and that is also above Arithmetician heals. If she has a low health teammate next to her, she will use Queen's Edict and her TMR before she even looks at her teammate's direction to heal them. Again, I didn't test this with all TMRs, only her own, so there is an opportunity that this might slightly get juggled around, but it's at least good to know that she does tend to prioritize it a little higher. The third one here, Law of Fortitude. This is if you have her main queen subjob equipped. This is the curative one. She will opt to heal a low health teammate, provided there's not an enemy in range, before doing the re-raise. This is actually a little bit further down here, Steel Determination. It's technically her third prioritized auto ability. Now, if you have the Arithmetician sub on, she will opt to heal before using Steel Determination as well. So if you're really relying on that re-raise of her, you have to be kind of careful about what abilities you have on and the order of them, which finally brings us to the Time Mage subjob. Haste is a very low priority here for her, and she will opt to haste a teammate that has the highest hate within range. So if you're talking about what are the odds of her hasting herself, which is why we're talking about that passive, it's actually pretty low because she will opt to do many of these things before even looking at the Time Mage subjob. So while it's certainly nice to have, not something to use reliably unless you disable a handful of things first. Which brings us now to the TMR analysis. So her TMR, the Sworn Sisters dress, overall the HP is decent enough. Unfortunately, cloth TMRs, the HP does skew a little bit lower than regular cloth that you can equip, but 10 defense is, double digits, nice starting point, and 15 accuracy is definitely material. That's a nice boost. Now, the next thing to note, 2 casts on a TMR is excellent. That's the new gold standard for TMRs. The fact that you can reliably use it, maybe not even just twice per battle, but knowing that you can have a Guild War attack and then in the next attack or the next defend, reliably have the same turn order because you'll recast the TMR, really awesome. And it does have fantastic range and spread. It's got a nice big diamond AoE height of 1. We're talking about the ability in particular though. 20 defense is cool and 20% missile resistance is cool, but unfortunately, modern era of penetration. If you're going against an enemy that has 40 and 8 defense penetration, another 10 on a Truststone passive, well, that 20 defense is only 10, which is cool, but not huge. And then for the missile resistance, that's obviously best against more like conventional missile comps, less so against the wind missile, which, obviously Macherie aside, if we're looking at just a TMR on any character, if you're going against Wind Missile, who got that excellent Jaden card with the 35% penetration, well, this 20% missile resistance is really only 13% missile resistance. Still impactful, just not exactly the same. So overall, good TMR, but I wouldn't pull her just for the TMR. Now finally, the general thoughts kind of encapsulating everything we've seen so far. So she does offer great teamfight utility as a damage dealer. The protectability, the 38% in peril, the 25% spirit in peril, the 125 summon gauge on evocative vestige, we'll talk about that in a second, and the AoE magic barrier break, all really great things to contribute to the battle. A little sneak peek into part 3, if you're trying to quantify what the 125 summon gauge looks like, if you can just picture this, that's what 125 summon gauge looks like. So while it may not be game-changing over the course of the battle, it's going to sneakily give a decent advantage, particularly with something I'm going to talk about more in part 3. So I'm going to leave it on the edge of your seat there. Overall, great modifiers as well in trade-off for cast time. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the modifiers, particularly with the fact that the protectability gives another 50. Also has a great mix of single target and AoE abilities. There's a lot of characters that are hampered by either skewing too far one way or the other, and she's just got both in all different parts of her kit. Well, really great that she can tap into both of those. Makes it very hard to defend against. 70% counter reduction is also no joke. As we talked about, the ability to cleave through tank counters is really awesome. Limited magic resistance penetration, though, at only 20% with the new rod. So that's why the overall kit, I ended up giving her a B on the report card, because although there's a lot of good things to like about it, it is relatively straightforward at the end of the day. It's basically just like a glorified black mage job to some degree, where it's really just like do a ton of magic damage. So she'll obviously struggle against those higher magic resistant enemies, but then again, that's the whole great part of Drain Strike, is that it's not magic type. Another great thing about her is that she really is a valuable magic unit for the Earth element, who has not really been tapping into that type of character. Obviously, Luel and Kilf have had their moments, I guess you could say, here and there, but really not as widespread as many other characters. It's just nice that you can throw her in an Earth comp, and you're now no longer so one-dimensional how you build your Earth, and obviously give some vision card flexibility as well by being able to put magic cards on her. And finally, she does have some survivability limitations. She does skew overall a little on the weaker side just because of the overall HP level and not having that innate defense or spirit. The re-raise is nice, but you really don't want to rely on a character's re-raise in order to win the battle. But overall, pretty solid character up and down. I am looking forward to opportunities to use her, although they are a little limited in the current state of the game. That's not always going to be the case going forward here. We're going to get some great ice tanks, which are going to fend off wind just a little bit. We're already super strong on the lightning side of things in global as well, so as long as lightning is still very competitive, Earth will as well, and she will certainly contribute greatly to that. But that's it for now. Hopefully this is insightful, informative. I'll have part 3 up relatively soon, and I will talk to you all later.